Blessed Man Meditations is where we provide answers for the evidential side of Christian belief. It doesn't have to be just about faith. It can be about faith and evidence, faith with reason because of evidence. And one of the resources that I'm going through on this channel is the book by cold case homicide detective J. Warner Wallace, where this cold case homicide detective, former atheist J. Warner Wallace, investigates the claims of the Gospels and discovers that they point to the validity of the authenticity of the Christian faith and turns from his atheism into being a Christian. In this chapter, chapter 3 of Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace, we learn to think circumstantially and respect the nature of circumstantial evidence. We have to talk about direct and circumstantial evidence. Evidence typically falls into two broad categories. Direct evidence is the evidence that can prove something all by itself. Trustworthy testimony is enough in and of itself to prove something. On the other hand, circumstantial evidence, also known as indirect evidence, does not prove something on its own, but points us in the right direction by proving something related to the question at hand. And for the case of Christianity, while we have direct evidence, we have the testimony of the eyewitnesses, we have a host of indirect evidence as well. And it's the indirect evidence in the claims of Christianity that help make a compelling case for the authenticity of Christianity. This related piece of evidence, indirect evidence, can be considered along with additional pieces of circumstantial indirect evidence in an attempt to figure out what really happened. The more pieces of consistent circumstantial evidence, the more reasonable the conclusion. The more cumulative the circumstantial evidence, the better the conclusion. And in the case of Christianity, there is a landslide of circumstantial evidence. And the problem is that people misdefine the use of they misuse the term evidence and think that the only kind of evidence that is valid is direct evidence. And because there does not appear to be a plethora of current direct evidence for Christianity, they fail to consider the landslide of indirect evidence. Whereas if they did, and they considered the cumulative effects of the landslide of indirect evidence, it would become unmistakable that Christianity is valid, evidential, and worth believing. Most people tend to think that direct evidence is required in order to be certain about what happened in a given situation. And that's just what I've been trying to say, that because there isn't direct evidence for a historical event that happened 2,000 years ago, people think that it can't be believed. But that's just not true. Believe it or not, the truth about cases that have no direct evidence connecting the suspect to the crime scene can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt when all the available evidence is circumstantial in nature. And that's what you have in Christianity. You have a host of circumstantial evidence, and we can compile that. Others have compiled that circumstantial historical evidence. And I think you can use it if you're willing to think objectively and without bias, that you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Christianity is true. Jurors are instructed to make no qualitative distinction between direct and circumstantial evidence in a case, as both direct and circumstantial evidence are deemed as acceptable types of evidence to prove or disprove the elements of a charge, including intent and mental state and acts necessary to a conviction, and neither is necessarily more reliable than the other. Yes, circumstantial evidence and direct evidence can both be considered reliable, depending on the case. And I think in the case of Christianity, you have circumstantial evidence that proves that the Christianity's claims are reliable, and that Jesus Christ is reliable and that he can be trusted. Jurors make decisions about the guilt of suspects in cases that are completely circumstantial every day. Many cold case homicides are successfully prosecuted with nothing but circumstantial evidence. So now let's talk about murder, circumstantial evidence, and certainty. Excuse me. Individual pieces of circumstantial evidence are rarely sufficient when taken on their own merit to prove a fact beyond a reasonable doubt. One piece of circumstantial evidence is most likely not going to be sufficient to prove a major claim. However, the cumulative effect of several pieces of circumstantial evidence when taken together can be very powerful. And as Wallace goes on in this chapter, he's going to snapshot several pieces of circumstantial evidence, and he's going to invite us to take them together and make a very powerful conclusion. So in the book, a story that happened that appears to be fictitious about someone named Ron, who is a person of interest in an unsolved homicide. In the book, Cold Case Christianity, the story about Ron is told, and it includes several pieces of circumstantial evidence, which when taken together point to Ron as a killer in a homicide, an unsolved homicide. The cumulative effect of all the circumstantial evidence in Ron's case, as presented in this book by Wallace, is that the only reasonable conclusion is that Ron is the murderer. So when you take a look at all the different pieces of circumstantial evidence, historical, archaeological, scientific, they all point to God's existence and the truth of Christianity, which can be embraced by faith, a reasonable evidential faith. So in this, juror verdicts are supposed to be reasonable conclusions. In this example, the case is entirely built on circumstantial evidence, the case against Ron in that murder. In that case against Ron, there's no forensic or eyewitness testimony. This is a textbook cold case. Jurors who understand the nature and power of circumstantial evidence should be able to render guilty verdicts when appropriate. And in the case of God's existence, there's no direct evidence, but there's a host of circumstantial evidence. A host of circumstantial evidence between the scientific facts that point to the beginning of the universe, the second law of thermodynamics, the radiation from the Big Bang, all that stuff from I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, Chapter 3, Surge, the fine-tuning of the universe, the evidence of design, say in DNA, the fact that digital code comes from minds, and DNA is a digital code. Just all these things. Then you have archaeology. All these things point to are pieces of circumstantial evidence that lead one to a reasonable inference that there must be intelligence behind everything. So let's look at the cosmic circumstantial case. The question of God's existence might be compared to our murder investigation. We assembled the circumstantial evidence and asked the question, how reasonable is it that this evidence can be interpreted in any way other than to indicate that Ron is the murderer? As the evidence accumulated, the likelihood of Ron's innocence shrank. Similarly, we can look at the evidence in our world and in the universe and ask how reasonable is it that this evidence can be interpreted in any way other than to confirm God's existence. For instance, we live in a universe filled with characteristics or evidences that demand an explanation. Let's consider just a few of them. First, the universe had a beginning. The vast majority of scientists continue to acknowledge that the universe came into being from nothing at some point in the distant past. Many have articulated this as the Big Bang Theory, commonly referred to as the standard model of cosmology. But if the universe begins to exist, what began it? What caused the first domino to fall in the long sequence of cause and effect dominoes? If this first domino fell over as the result of being toppled by some other domino, how far back does this sequence go? It's an infinite regress. Scientists understand the absurdity of an endless sequence of dominoes spanning back into an infinite eternity. Everyone is looking for an uncaused first cause that's capable of starting the domino run all by itself. This uncaused first cause must exist outside of space, time, and matter, as nothing has ever been observed to cause itself to exist. And of course, there are theories about universes springing into existence out of nothing. Those are just theories. I don't understand there to be evidence supporting those theories. Okay, what could be uncaused and powerful enough to cause the universe? If the caused universe was once was not, why is the caused universe here at all? As Leibniz famously wrote, why is there something rather than nothing? We typically think of God as an eternal, all-powerful being who exists outside of space-time and matter. The evidence of the finite universe, a universe that has a beginning, points circumstantially to the existence of such a God. So the evidence that the universe had a beginning points to the circumstantial fact that something must have begun it. An incredibly powerful uncaused first cause outside of time, space, and matter appears to be necessary in order to bring our universe into existence. If an eternal, all-powerful being exists, Leibniz's famous question has an answer, that there's something rather than nothing, because someone has always existed to begin something from nothing. God has always existed from eternity and chose to create the universe from nothing. A being of this nature, the eternal, all-powerful being, might freely choose to create a universe that demonstrated his power and served as a place where his cherished creatures could begin to understand his nature. And that's why God created the universe, so we could look at it and see that it points to him in a myriad of ways, and that he desires to have a relationship with us. And one of the means that God created to elicit a response from us to seek a relationship with him is the fact that he created us in this universe with all these characteristics so that we would seek him and be found by him. The causal evidence of the universe is a significant piece of circumstantial evidence for God's existence. So let's look at the cosmological argument as the causal evidence. Anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe must have a cause. This cause must be eternal and uncaused, and God is the most reasonable explanation for an uncaused first cause. You'll hear people say, well, so you say God created everything. Well, who created God? Well, that misses the point of the question. The theistic view is that God did not begin to exist, that he is eternal. And many skeptics have a problem with an eternal God, but yet they don't want to have a problem with an eternal universe. Well, if you're going to say that the universe can be eternal, why couldn't God be eternal instead of the universe? So, on the cosmological argument, God is the most reasonable explanation for the uncaused first cause, the universe beginning to exist. Let's look next, after the beginning of the universe, let's look at the universe having an appearance of design. Science has also helped us understand that the universe appears to be remarkably fine-tuned to support the existence of life. We've gone through some of the fine-tuning when we went through I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. We went through some of the fine-tuning when we went through Is Atheism Dead? There are multiple chapters on this channel devoted to the topic of fine-tuning. When I went through Is Atheism Dead, there were multiple things like water and sunlight and other things that I had no idea were so finely tuned to support life. There are a number of forces in the cosmos that are precisely calibrated to work together to make life possible. The laws of electron mass, atomic mass, proton mass, strong and weak nuclear forces, speed of light, cosmological constant, gravity, universe mass, and many more are finely tuned to govern the universe and our world. Even within the atom itself, the precise relationship between protons, neutrons, and electrons appears to be fine-tuned and calibrated. According to the famous atheist, the late Stephen Hawking, if the proton-neutron mass difference were not about twice the mass of the electron, one would not obtain the couple of hundred or so stable nucleosides that make up the elements and are the basis of chemistry and biology. The forces in our universe, both small and large, appear to be fine-tuned to make life possible. In addition to these cosmic and atomic forces, there are also specific conditions that are necessary for a planet to support life. If, for example, the size of the Earth were altered slightly, life would not be possible on the planet. When a planet's too small, it loses internal heat and cannot keep its interior core active. If a planet is too large, it will have too much water and too thick of an atmosphere. As it turns out, the characteristics of a planet must be just so for life to be possible. The presence of liquid water, the proper distance from the star, the existence of a terrestrial crust, a properly proportioned magnetic field, the correct ratio of oxygen to nitrogen in the atmosphere, the existence of a large moon, and the mother star of a specific and particular size and type are all required. The path that leads to life on Earth seems to be very narrow and difficult, yet the forces that govern the universe and our world appear to have a goal in mind. That goal is the production of a universe in which carbon-based life can emerge. So all of these fine-tuning parameters show that in order for life to be possible, all these things must be a particular way, and they just so happen to be a particular way. And of course, one of the common responses to the argument for God's existence from fine-tuning is that, well, maybe we live in a multiverse and we just happen to live in the one that has this fine-tuning, and there might be other universes that don't have it, but we just happen to be in the Goldilocks universe. Of course, that's ludicrous because there's no evidence for the multiverse. It's just a theory that people come up with to escape the reality of God and try to escape from God. So how can random forces be so conspicuously aligned and organized to support life? How is it merely coincidence that they are? It's certainly possible that it's a mere coincidence, but is it reasonable that these things are the way they are to support life? If God exists, God's capable of fine-tuning the universe, and he just might have a reason to do it. He might want to create a universe in which we can live so that we can know him. The Bible, for example, describes God as the maker of heaven and earth in Psalm 115, and it describes him as the being who designed and created the universe with the earth in mind. The fine-tuning of the universe is another important point of circumstantial evidence that points to the existence of an intentional, supernatural, powerful, and creative being. So let's look at the anthropic principle. The anthropic principle is another term used to describe the fine-tuning evidence. And it says that the physical constants and laws of the universe appear to be uniquely and specifically related to one another or fine-tuned, making life possible on Earth. The fine-tuned relationships of these laws and constants appear to be designed, as their existence by natural unguided means seems improbable and unlikely. Yes, this fine-tuning is unlikely to have come about by natural processes. A design requires an intelligent designer. An incredibly vast and complex design requires an incredibly intelligent and powerful designer, and God fits that. The God of the Bible fits that description. He's incredibly intelligent, and infinitely powerful, and therefore God is the most reasonable explanation for such a vast universal designer and fine-tuner. Now let's look at a universe with complex life. The appearance of design. Scientists observe what they call the appearance of design in biological systems. Even Richard Dawkins, the renowned and vocal atheist emeritus, fellow of New College, Oxford, concedes that biological systems can often appear designed, although he proposes that a blind natural process can somehow account for this appearance of design. Blind, natural, unguided processes. To think that blind, unguided natural processes can design anything is, in my opinion, laughable. There are many examples of cellular biological machines that demonstrate characteristics of specified complexity and bear a striking resemblance to systems and structures that have been designed by humans or intelligent agents. So these cellular biological machines look like something that was developed by intelligence. And of course, in the theistic worldview, God is that designing intelligence. These characteristics lead many to the unreasonable belief that unguided forces are simply insufficient. These characteristics, this design, lead many to the reasonable belief that unguided forces are insufficient to create such biological machines. William Dembski, the well-known mathematician, statistician, theologian, and intelligent design advocate, has argued that specified complexity and therefore the intervention of an intelligent agent can be identified by using an explanatory filter. If an object or event cannot be explained by some natural law that necessitates its appearance, the most reasonable inference is that it is the product of an intelligent designer. If an object or event exists in spite of the high improbability that it could occur as the result of chance, the most reasonable inference is that it is the product of an intelligent designer. If an object or event conforms to an independently existing and recognizable pattern, the most reasonable inference is that it is the product of an intelligent designer. Perhaps the most important evidence suggesting the involvement of an intelligent designer is the presence of DNA and the guiding role that this DNA plays in the formation of biological systems. Science has demonstrated that DNA is actually a digital code. DNA is specified information. DNA exhibits characteristics that, when examined through Dembski's explanatory filter, are best explained by the creative activity of an intelligent designer. As Stephen Meyer argues in his book Signature in the Cell, intelligence is the only known cause of functionally integrated information processing systems. In other words, in the history of scientific and intellectual research, we can find no example in which information came from anything other than an intelligent source. Information comes from minds. DNA contains information. Therefore, DNA must come from a mind. That mind must be powerful and knowledgeable about everything. The only reasonable inference, then, is a God. If DNA is a form of specified information that guides the complex process of cellular information and biological structures, intelligent design stands as the best, most causally adequate explanation for this feature of a cell, that it contains information, just as it stands as the best explanation for the origin of the information present in DNA itself. If biological systems display characteristics of design in the form of specified complexity, it's reasonable to conclude that a designer had been involved in the process. So if there is specified complexity, then a designer must have designed it that way. What kind of designer could be responsible for the information specified complexity? If God exists, he would certainly possess the characteristics and power to accomplish creating the information in specified complexity. The presence of the specified information in biological systems is yet another piece of circumstantial evidence that points to God's existence. Next, let's look at objective morality. Each and every one of us feels a certain obligation to moral duty. We have an intuitive sense of moral oughtness. We don't agree where that moral oughtness comes from or what it tells us we should or should not do, but we do agree that almost universally that there is moral oughtness for everyone. We recognize some things are right and some things are wrong, regardless of where you live, when you live, and the culture in which you live. We understand that it's never morally right to lie, steal, or kill for fun. These moral laws, or as William Lane Craig says, torture a baby for fun. These moral laws are transcendent and objective. Their truth is not subjective opinion. Regardless of how we might feel about these laws, their truth lies in the actions. Their moral truth lies in the actions themselves, not in our subjective opinions. We may discover moral truth, but we do not invent it. Truth does not change. We discover it. Morality does not change. We discover it. Because of this, we're able to look across history and culture and make meaningful judgments about the moral rightness or wrongness of any given set of actions. We recognize that culture itself cannot be the source of moral law, and that there instead is a law above all laws, and that transcends all of us. So where does transcendent objective moral truth come from? Well, morality deals with obeying and disobeying. We obey or disobey laws. It is the breaking of laws that leads to incarceration or some other form of penalty. Laws always come from lawgivers. So where does this objective moral law, if laws always come from lawgivers, where does this law come from? I think the theist would have to say it would be a being that transcends all of us. And the most reasonable explanation for that, therefore, is a God. And then through further study and further explanation, you can arrive at the God of the Bible. All moral laws come from lawmakers. If there exists even one transcendent moral law, that it's, for instance, that it's never morally right to kill someone for fun, there must be a transcendent moral source. Someone must have made that law. Darwinian evolution, which says that morality does not develop based on a lawgiver, has great difficulty accounting for the objective morality, the objective moral obligations for two reasons. First, on Darwinian evolution, if we live in a purely natural physical world governed by cause and effect relationships between chemical processes in our brains, free will is an illusion, and the true moral choice is nonsensical, right? Free will does not exist on Darwinian evolution. How can any murderer be held accountable for a series of chemical reactions that occurred in his brain when he didn't have the freedom to escape the causal chain of biological events, right? Why have a criminal justice system if there is no such thing as free will? In addition to this, Darwinian evolution could not produce truly objective morality. If moral truths are merely behavioral concepts that humans have created to aid their survival, morality is once again rooted in the subject, humans, rather than in the objective moral truth claim under consideration, whether it's ever morally right to kill someone for fun. So, but on theism, moral truths are not behavioral concepts that we've created to aid our survival. There's actually transcendent truth that's right for everyone, for all time, in all locations. If morality is simply a convention of our species, we better hope that science fiction writers are wrong about the possibility of sentient life in other parts of the universe. Unless there's a law above all laws, an entity such as Star Trek's United Federation of Planets would be powerless to stop immoral behavior. Objective morality must be rooted in something bigger than the evolutionary development of any one species. If God exists, he would certainly transcend all species, cultures, locations, and moments in time. For this reason, the existence of a transcendent moral truth is best explained by God's existence as the transcendent source for such truth. Once again, we have an important piece of circumstantial evidence. The cumulative circumstantial case for God's existence is much like the circumstantial case we made in our murder investigation. The more evidence we gathered, the clearer it was that Ron's involvement as the killer could account for all of it. Ron was either incredibly unlucky or incredibly guilty. At some point, we recognized that the evidence made Ron's guilt in the matter the only reasonable inference, and we got there without a single piece of direct evidence. In a similar way, the circumstantial evidence in our universe is consistent with God's existence and involvement as the uncaused first cause, the fine-tuner, the designer, and the moral lawgiver required to account for all the evidence we observe. As in the homicide investigation, the more evidence we gather, the more reasonable our conclusion becomes. We've only briefly described 4 lines of circumstantial evidence for God's existence. Much more can and has been said about these areas of evidence by the expert witnesses listed at the end of the book. In addition to these evidences, investigators and philosophers have offered many additional arguments, including the ontological argument, the transcendental argument, the argument from religious or aesthetic experience, and many more. The cumulative circumstantial evidence pointing to God's existence is either incredibly coincidental or a compelling indication of the truth of the matter. Yeah, it's just a series of random coincidences that give us the illusion that there is a God if there is no God. But they could also be taken together to compel us to recognize that God does exist, love us, and want us to be reconciled to him. At some point, God's existence is the only reasonable inference in the light of the evidence, like our homicide, We can get there without a single piece of direct or forensic evidence. As a circumstantial case against Ron grew, the likelihood of his guilt also grew. As a circumstantial case for God grows, the likelihood of his existence also grows. If the evidence for Ron's guilt is compelling enough to reasonably conclude that he's guilty, then the evidence for God's existence is compelling enough to reasonably conclude that God exists. So, it's time to add another principle to our investigative checklist as we assemble the tools we'll need to investigate and communicate the claims of Christianity. Circumstantial evidence has been unfairly maligned over the years. It's important to recognize that this form of evidence is not inferior in the eyes of the law. In fact, there are times when you can trust circumstantial evidence far more than you can trust direct evidence. Witnesses, for example, can lie or be mistaken about their observations. They must be evaluated before they can be trusted. We'll talk about that in the next chapter. Circumstantial evidence, on the other hand, cannot lie. It is what it is. You and I have the ability to assess and make an inference from the circumstantial evidence using our own reasoning power to come to a conclusion. It's not a coincidence that Wallace was an unbeliever before he learned anything about the nature of evidence. In those days, as he was evaluating Christianity's claims, he demanded direct evidence that simply isn't available to anyone studying historical events. That's true of any historical events. Of any historical event, there's no direct evidence like there is in a recent event, like these, when studying history, like studying a cold case, there's rarely direct evidence. When studying a recent murder, like studying recent news, there is direct evidence. But you can't always have direct evidence because it's not available. So Wallace failed to see that rejecting or devaluating circumstantial evidence would prevent him from understanding anything about history when the eyewitnesses to that particular historical event were unavailable. If he continued to reject or devalue circumstantial evidence, he would never successfully prosecute a single cold case. All of us need to respect the power and nature of circumstantial evidence in determining truth so that we can be open to the role circumstantial evidence plays in making the case for Christianity. Wallace is alarmed sometimes when Christians make inaccurate statements related to the nature of evidence. When discussing evidence with skeptics, Christians don't need to concede that a particular fact related to the Christian worldview is not a piece of evidence simply because it's not a piece of direct evidence. There's plenty of circumstantial evidence to make a robust case for Christianity, and that's what this channel and other channels are like mine are devoted to. Even though a particular fact may not have the individual power to prove the case for Christianity in its entirety, it's no less valuable as we assemble the evidence. You got to take all the pieces as parts of a whole. When we treat circumstantial evidence as though it's not evidence at all, we do ourselves a disservice as ambassadors for the Christian worldview. And that's what many skeptics do. They treat all the circumstantial evidence, the complexity of the cell, the fine-tuning, the evidence that the universe began to exist, the existence of objective moral values and duties, the design in the universe. They treat all this circumstantial evidence as though it's not evidence at all. Christians, when they make that mistake, they fail to be effective ambassadors for Christianity. When skeptics do make that mistake, they fail to appreciate the evidence for theism and for Christianity. Circumstantial evidence is powerful if it's properly understood. When defending our belief in God's existence, the resurrection of Jesus, or the validity of the Christian worldview, we may need to take some time to explain the nature, role, and power of circumstantial evidence. It's time well spent because most of our friends, family members, and coworkers have not given much thought to the reality that circumstantial evidence is powerful. We need to help people understand the depth and quality of the evidence that supports Christianity. Remember, circumstantial cases are powerful when they are cumulative. The more evidence that points to a specific explanation, the more reasonable that explanation becomes, and the more likely that the evidence can be explained away as coincidental. The more unlikely that the evidence can be explained away as coincidental. The better the evidence is, the more compelling a case the evidence makes collectively, the more unlikely that it can be explained away as coincidental. So, take time to discover and master the evidence for yourself so you can articulate the deep, rich, robust evidential support for Christianity's claims. That is the end of Chapter 3 in J. Warner Wallace's Cold Case Christianity. Next time, Chapter 4, Principle 4, Test Your Witnesses. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and have a blessed rest of your day. I see the